Willkommen in einem neuen video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 41 of my game system design series. In this video I'll be exploring Napoleonic rules scales and the implication of those scales when considering what size of battle you wish to play. I'm obviously not going to cover all the rules available, as that would make this video hours in length, but my objective is to select a list of Napoleonic rules, investigate their scales and determine the gaming ramifications of those scales, specifically in relation to scenarios. The primary objective is to determine what type of conflict each set of rules is really designed to address. A set of rules which can comfortably allow players to reproduce the Battle of Marengo will probably not be suitable to refight the Battle of Leipzig, and vice versa. In my analysis, I'll be using some basic rules for game length, playing area size, and numbers of elements. Optimally, I would like a game to last between 2 to 4 hours of gameplay, 2 hours of both players if both players are highly experienced, and 4 hours for less experienced players. In addition, it would be expected some setup time and pack-up time allowance would be required. But at a worst case, I would like 2 players to never spend more than 6 hours to have a game which has a clear and definitive result. If players have 8 hours for a game, you could certainly increase the game length by 25% or the number of elements by 25%, so it's not a hard and fast rule. Rules which use movement trays can result in a much larger number of elements, although this does depend on the way the movement trays are used. I'll try and take this into account, but while I've used many of the rules I'll be listing, I'm not an expert in all of those rules. Game length can be a major issue for some rules, especially low-scale rules. As a general rule, a set of rules which can reproduce an entire battle should have a length required to refight that entire battle. Some battles are unusually long and are closer to 2 separate battles, so the Battle of Marengo could be considered as 2 separate battles and the length modified accordingly. I find a useful general rule is if over the entire length of a 12-game turn game a player has 50 elements, he can easily complete a game within the time frames that I have stipulated. I've covered this formula before in previous videos, and it's based on board game play, but after timing a reasonably large number of figure games, this formula does seem to be quite true. 2 hours would apply to experienced players, 4 hours would apply to new players, which have read the rules but with minimal gameplay experience. The impact of trays is more difficult to pin down, but if the tray is the element with the figures in the tray having minimal impact, but there is some strength point tracking, then each value which needs to be tracked can be considered an additional element's worth of effort. Thus, Blue Show, which tracks 1 value, would result in each tray representing 2 elements, 1 for the tray and 1 for the value. As you can see, Blue Show is a game system which offers the possibility of very short games. Let's now look at actual rules to determine what force mixes are reasonable for a game length which fits into our 2 to 4 hour game limit play. The first Empire are rather old rules which were designed for 25mm figures, so for consistency I'll convert them into rules suitable for 15mm figures. This means the base width would drop from 6cm to 4cm. Each element represents about 160 men, as each figure represents 40 men. This means each player could be expected to command about 8,000 men each, which makes it about 16 battalions of infantry per side. For now, let's ignore cavalry, as if we deploy cavalry we would be replacing each infantry element with 2 cavalry elements, or perhaps 2 infantry with 3 cavalry. But for simplicity, I'll only focus on line infantry. As for ground scale, some assumptions need to be made. If each element represents 160 men in line, then its width would be about 40 metres. This gives us a ground scale of 1 centimetre equals 10 metres, or 1 in 1,000 scale. If the playing area was 3 by 4 feet, or 90 centimetres by 120 centimetres, this would represent a playing area which is 1.2 kilometres wide and 0.9 kilometres deep, which does align with the French front line at Marengo, for example. Maximum musket fire would be 10 centimetres, as this would represent about 100 metres. Maximum cannon range would range from 60 to 180 centimetres, depending on the size of the cannon. Optimal range is probably half that value. This does seem rather long range, and I would suspect that for a game this may not be the best range to use, or optimal. All this would allow a player to command a force which is the size of Victor's corps at Marengo. At 12 game turns, we would be looking at about 4 to 6 hours, which would represent the initial defence against the initial Austrian attack. This would make a very reasonable scenario. Let's now look at WRG, Wargame Rules, 1685 to 1845. These rules were also designed for 25mm, but also included 15mm, which is the more common for today. I'll scale it up to a modern 15mm figure base width because this uses a rather unusual base width. Each element represents about 200 men, as each figure represents 50 men. This means each player would be expected to command about 10,000 men each, which would make it about 20 battalions of infantry per side. WRG rules used a different figure scale for cavalry, and while I initially thought this was a mistake or wrong, I now feel it was wise, and it was designed to ensure the width of the cavalry element was identical to that of the infantry. The only unusual aspect was artillery frontage, which seemed too little. Thus, to avoid all confusion, let's just focus on infantry. As for ground scale, using the 3cm wide 15mm bases, the ground scale was 1 in 3,168, or 20 inches per mile. If we adjust this to 40cm wide bases, the ground scale drops to about 1 in 2,000. If we use 3-rank line with an average frontage of 0.75 metres per man, the element width should be about 50 metres, or 12.5 metres per centimetre, which would give us a ground scale, in this case, of 1 in 1,250. I'm uncertain why there's such a discrepancy between these two scales, but to remain consistent, I'll stay with a ground scale of 1 in 1,250. If the playing area was 3 by 4 feet, or 90 centimetres by 120 centimetres, this would represent a playing area which is 1.5 kilometres wide and 1.125 kilometres deep. This is not a major change from our early example, and gives us a large corps or 2 small corps per side in theory. You could probably refight the entire first stage of Marengo with these rules. We've gone through the maths around how I calculate all these ratios. Let's take a look at a list of rules and do the same things. Just to emphasise, this is not a complete list of all the Napoleonic rules. The other point to note is, due to the different basing systems, I've had to do some conversion in order to normalise all these rules, especially for the board game rules that I've covered here. This adds a margin of error to these values, but let's assume we are reasonably on target. Of course, the method I calculate the width of an element assumes the entire element adopts line formation, which is not reality. While it's possible for a battalion to form line, once the element manpower exceeds a battalion, strength of 500 to 1,000 men, the frontage does tend to decrease. As it turns out, this only really affects a few rules where each element exceeds the upper limit of about 1,000. The other point to consider is the rules need to be able to support gameplay where elements support other elements. If the rules encourage a player to form an entire army up in a line, then we get some rather bizarre effects. For example, at Marengo, the initial frontage line was about 2,000 metres in length. The 2 initial French corps numbers about a maximum of 8,000 men, so the troop density was about 4 men per metre. On the other hand, the Austrian force numbered significantly more, so the density was in the order of 8 men per metre. While large parts of the army were deployed in line, forces were present in the rear, and some forces may well have been in column. At Wagram, the densities were similar. The main line of conflict, shown here, was about 10 kilometres in length, with about 65,000 Austrians covering that line. This gives you a density of about 6.5 men per metre, with the French density being higher, possibly in the order of about 8 per metre. If the Austrians formed up into one large 3-rank line, the front line would be more like 16 kilometres and the French almost 20 kilometres in length. I must admit I did expect higher densities before I started this analysis, but this does indicate we need to be careful extrapolating the width of a small formation. On average, each army formed up in formations which averaged 6 or more ranks in depth. It also goes without saying troop densities varied a great deal on the front line based on their posture. In an ideal attack formation, the densities would be higher. This shows a Prussian 1812 ideal attack formation consisting of 6 battalions of infantry, a battery of guns and 2 squadrons of light cavalry. The depth here was significantly greater than its width, and most formations were in column. This could also explain why even the French could take several hours to form up their forces for attack, or as they used similar structures from about 1805 onwards. At other points of the front line, it would be expected the army would form a line for defence and thus could extend out much more left and right. Scale is a critical element of game design, as it affects almost all aspects of game mechanics. Rules which try and bypass scale are normally trying to minimise the downside of a specific scale, while maximising the upside of a different scale. This works if your objective is a set of rules focused on having a game rather than attempting to reproduce reality or history. I tend to fall in the user-consistent scale camp, which means the main issue is identifying the scale which meets your needs. The maximum army size per side is rather interesting when you actually look at it. The Battle of Leipzig is not viable even using rules such as Snappy Nappy and Grosse Schlachten. You could do it, but you would exceed your 2 to 4 hour limit very quickly. These two rules can easily handle all the other larger battles of the war, such as Borodino or Wagram, but few other rules have any chance of doing those, of covering those large battles. Most battles during the period ranged from 20,000 per side up to 100,000 per side, with the most common in the 40,000 to 60,000 range. I can now see why Napoleon's battle was so popular, as it was the first set of rules printed which allowed you to fight battles of this size. I may need to relook at my copy of Napoleon's War, although some of the basing is problematic, in my opinion. The ground scale, as you would expect, matches up with the maximum army side per side. Napoleon's battle on a 3x4 foot playing area would allow you to refight a battle with a frontage of 7.2 kilometres. On a large 4x6 foot playing area, this could expand out to 10.8 kilometres. As battles got large, troop density also went up, which is interesting. Thus, these distances would easily allow you to refight any battle up to the 50,000 men per side zone or range. The maximum musket ranges are also of interest. Musket range of less than 2 centimetres per side can get rather fiddly, which means many of the high-scale rules may be better off ignoring musket fire entirely or submerging it into the melee system. Saying that, the concept of rounding up is also viable, so apart from Snappy Nappy and Grossen Schlachten, musket fire is generally possible in all these rules. As for artillery fire, this is viable for all sets of rules, although at 30 centimetres to 180 centimetres the range is so large it could cover most of the playing area, which causes its own game mechanic issues. I need to point out that in the original WRG rules, the ground scale is actually 1 in 3,000. This was basically a combination of using 3 centimetre wide elements and a much higher density of troops than I've estimated. This could allow you a large playing area, but the main bottleneck is numbers of elements, and that is the primary limitation to game size for those rules. This higher density could apply with other rules, but the fundamental issue of having too many elements to push around remains. If the rules use a big base approach, where the base does all the fighting, the story is kind of different. This does apply with the rules Napoleon's Battles, which is kind of a big base type set of rules. So in theory, these rules allow you to command more than 50 elements. In practice, something about these rules negates that advantage, and that is something which I need to drill down in order to discover why. As if Napoleon Battles uses a type of big base, it should be able to allow players to command more than 50 elements, possibly even as much as 100, which would allow you to dramatically increase the size of battles it could handle within the time frame I've stipulated. I'll need to investigate this in more detail. I suspect some basic game mechanics simplification could give me what I want here. As in Napoleon's Battles, it's true, all fire combat is done by the big base, that's a whole heap of different elements. You still have to move the elements around into different formations, and that's probably the reason why you can't get that big base effect or benefit with those particular rules. There are other rules which use big bases, such as Blücher, so there are the solutions to allow players to fight even the largest battles of the Napoleonic Wars. However, I mainly focus on rules which use figures on an element as the primary gaming element, rather than a almost board game approach that you would see typically in a set of rules such as Blücher. Now we're going to be entering the world of subjective opinion. What I do feel are suitable rules for different objectives. You may have noticed that I'm not covering skirmish rules, only rules which allow you to refight a meaningfully large battle. While I have used rules such as WRG and Empire 3rd Edition many times in the past, I feel the scale is not what I'm really looking for. These rules may well be able to create a parts of a battle or an unusually small engagement, but unless I can recreate a battle the size of Marengo, which is a comparatively small conflict, I'd probably not be too interested in these rules. The other issue is artillery range. When this gets too long, you can experience game issues or game system issues, and at least needs very detailed multiple contoured terrain in order to negate the issues. You need hills to restrict artillery fire ranges. The next set of rules do allow you to reproduce the smaller battles, of which there are many during the Napoleonic War and during the previous period, during the Revolutionary Wars. Marengo would fit into this category easily. These rules, I feel, represent the sweet spot. Apart from the largest and smallest battles, most battles would fall into this category. This scale also allows you to retain musket fire as distinct from melee. I suspect if you took these rules and attempted to simplify them as much as possible, you may be able to increase the number of figures you could command and thus get larger battles, but that would require modifying the rules. Rules which fit into this category can accommodate the larger battles. In many cases, you could easily have much smaller conflicts using these rules, which make them even faster to play, but it's probably not their sweet spot. I consider this the main scale that I personally prefer, as I would like to command corps. However, at this scale, you do lose some of the flavour of Napoleonic warfare. If you want to try and get a midpoint, this is probably the best scale for Napoleonic warfare. It allows you to reproduce reasonably large battles and also retain some flavour. For now, let's put volume, bayonet, DBM and rank and file to one side, as they're a bit of an unusual rule set. We're left with Napoleon's battles and probably Charcot. I find it odd that rules designed back in 1989 are still so viable and hit that magic sweet spot. Interesting observation. As it's not particularly in my nature to modify other people's rules, I went searching for a board game I could convert into a figure gaming format. My initial target was Wellington's Victory, but after a lot of analysis, the scale is simply too small. I really need an optional scale of 240 to 250 men per element. The other alternative is a big base system where each element is a company, or where each element is a strength point. But let's put big base approaches to one side for now. The rules which really fit into this category is rank and file, DBM and Napoleonic Kriegsführung. The first two are rather unusual sets, as I've mentioned, and the last is a set of rules I developed from a non-Napoleonic set of rules, and as such may be problematic. However, this is the scale that I feel you need to target. In terms of trying to identify the ideal sweet spot, by sheer coincidence, I did make an attempt in this direction with a set of rules I call Napoleonic Kriegsführung version 2. This is strangely enough based on a set of Cold War micro-armour rules, which was published back in the 1980s. The issue I have I have little interest in designing rules from almost scratch and would prefer building on the works of others. I'm also warming to the US basing system from Napoleonic, so I need a set of rules which uses elements that use that, or is at least element width agnostic. These rules do require WRG basing type elements. One possible answer is in something like Napoleonic's battles rules, but upscale to, let's say, 1001 to 6200 ground scale or thereabouts. And that may actually be an interesting project, either the upscaled Napoleon's battles, which for copyright reason may be unwise, or to base it on SPI Wellington's Victories board game, which due to the massive changes may overcome any copyright issues. I could also go back to Napoleonic Kriegsführung, but it's based on a traditional set of figure gaming rules which lack the fast play aspect of rules such as, DBN, Snappy Nappy, BBN, DN, or even Grosse Schlachten, so I'm not sure if that's a good option. One method of overcoming the scale issue is through the use of big bases. This could also allow you to achieve maximum bling while keeping the game playable. If your big bases contain 4 elements and each big base moved and fought as a single unit, then you could deploy 4 times the elements on your playing area and still achieve your game length objective. The big bases would increase element width, so your playing area now needs to be much larger. There are physical limitations you do need to always consider. If your element width is 4 centimeters, a playing area which is 4 feet wide is probably your optimal size. If you group your elements into big bases of 4 elements, the width turns out to be 8 centimeters, which means you now need a playing area 8 feet wide and possibly 6 feet deep. This is about the maximum size possible. There is a method to partially overcome this. If we're using the US basing system, which uses elements 2 centimeters wide, you can increase element density. It now becomes viable to deploy 100 elements per side, assuming you'll accept a longer game. If we double the width and depth of this formation, we end up with 8 elements in a nice block, which does require a large 8 foot by 6 foot playing area, but this still does provide an interestingly viable solution. This is why I believe the US basing system was developed. Either on purpose or by accident, it allows maximum bling on a large playing area. You could even retain your 3 by 4 foot playing area using a unit size of 4 elements, as you can see here. The other advantage of a big base approach is the ground scale can be designed to allow players to still engage in musket fire over between 50 and 100 metres. Ground scale of 1 in 4,000 could allow you to have musket fire range 2 centimetres, which is a small number but probably still acceptable. At this scale you are pushing any game system to almost breaking point. At 1 in 4,000 scale, using big bases and US based elements on a 8 foot by 6 foot playing area, each element can represent 1,000 men. This allows you to deploy, in theory, the largest army ever fielded in the Napoleonic War, although the physical size issue would probably reduce that to a maximum of 200,000 per side, and an optimal size of 100,000 per side if you want some manoeuvring room. Thus, on a ground scale of 1 in 2,000, it's probably what I would be probably aiming for. There are other issues with my crazy ideas. At 8,000 men per big base, each base is a small corps, which may not be optimal. Each big base should be no more than a division or a large brigade, so winding down the element scale to accommodate that would be the best solution. If each big base is a division or equivalent, we end up with an army of about 50 divisions, which would give you, once you factor in cavalry and artillery, about 4 to 5 corps. While not Leipzig in size, I suspect this would keep most Napoleonic commanders very happy indeed. It should always be remembered the key to rules design is to find a seeming gap in the market and address that rather than create something in a saturated market. I think I may have found a gap in the market, which is the scale which we've been discussing. And so we come to an end of my episode 41 of my video on game system design, in this case looking at Napoleonic Rule Scale. Alle guten Dinge, kommen zu einem Ende.